Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce Jeffrey Schloss again, who's Professor and Chair of Biology at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, California. He's taught at the University of Michigan, Wheaton College, Jaguar Creek Tropical Research Center, and he was formerly Academic Dean and Head of Biological Programs for the Christian Environmental Association, and Research Consultant in Evolutionary Biology for the Institute for Research on Unlimited Love. He obtained his PhD in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Washington University and undergraduate training in Biology and Philosophy from Wheaton College. He's received many awards, including being elected a Danforth Fellow, AAAS Mass Media Science Fellow, a charter member of the International Society for Science and Religion, a member of the Evangelical Academy of Science and Ethics, and his book Evolution and Ethics, edited with Philip Clayton, was chosen as a 2005 Templeton Science and Religion Book of Distinction.
So today we're talking about, I think, one of the most fascinating vanguards of evolutionary theory. Certainly one of the most prolific since I visited Faraday last, which was a year ago, about half a dozen monographs. Scores of papers have come out on this, on evolutionary theories of human religion. Now, we left off last time having described a fascinating, I view it as a pageant actually, although that one that has involved advances and humiliations, but nevertheless a pageant of forward understanding of the nature of human altruism that begun with quite ambitious, triumphalistic even, confidence that everything about social structure could be explained by just two tools, kin selection and reciprocal altruism. And those look like they do a very good job in the non-human animals, but it has universally acknowledged that we have needed additional tools to explain human social behavior, and we went through a cast of characters and ended up with the strangest tool, really, for biologists to have invoked, and because it's a non-material and ultimately non-biological tool of explanation. That's, as I ended, quite controversial amongst biological theorists on the one hand and also amongst social theorists on the other hand, but at the very least in its acknowledgement that the human behavioral repertoire includes elements that are not reducible to behaviors which are simply and clearly constrained by genetic fitness mechanisms. Now, I actually have had several evangelical Christian publicists pick up on those observations and say, see, we told you that human beings had a supernatural soul that could never be explained by natural mechanisms. That could be the case, but that's not a warranted inference from that observation. If there's a God of the gaps, there's probably also a soul of the gaps, and we'll have to see. But the two issues on the table right now for debate is, first of all, a methodological one. To whatever extent that we need additional tools for explaining apparently distinctly human behaviors, and it could always turn out they won't end up being distinct, but to whatever extent we need these tools, is memetics itself a helpful paradigm? The vote is not in on that yet, but it hasn't seemed to help much yet. Secondly, whatever tool we use, how do we relate this other stream of information influencing human behavior to what surely is going on, which is selection on the human genome to create fundamental cognitive capacities? That's a big question, and one that's debated within the community of full adherence to evolutionary theory. So, for example, the debates between Gould and Dawkins. Gould calling Dawkins a Darwinian fundamentalist. And I think it went, first when I heard that term, I thought it was a little overly abrasive, but taken a cautious understanding of what fundamentalism means. One of the leading scholars of fundamentalism in the U.S. is the psychologist Ralph Hood. He doesn't use it in a pejorative term. He describes fundamentalism as an intra-textual epistemology, a way of understanding the world that is solely rooted in or viewed through the lens of a particular text. And in that sense, Dawkins probably would be a Darwinian fundamentalist. His epistemology is solely intratextual. In fact, he believes that Darwinism can even explain how we understand, not just all we understand. To put it in the context of ideas that we were talking about yesterday in terms of game theory, the debate on the table right now is to what extent evolutionary game theory is concordant with economic game theory. And by that I mean economic game theory plays these little games in terms of human utilities, what humans value, what their goals are. Evolutionary game theory plays games in terms of payoff. The payoff is fitness. So to what extent does human goals, values, and utilities map natural selection's goals, values, and utilities? Dan Dennett, in his book, and by the way, in his former book, Freedom Evolves, Dennett needed to end up employing mimetics very seriously to get him out of a trap. He begins the book by saying, I'm a determinist, and I mean by determinism that from any given present there is only one possible future. As he followed the chain of argument down the Darwinian path, he admitted that human behaviors certainly weren't concordant with what you would expect from genetic determinism. He needed another agent, so he did employ genetics very heavily in his argument, although eugenics, memetics, although he also admitted that it was a young and unproven discipline. In his book, Breaking the Spell, he opens up with something like this. Not something like this, with this. Everything we value, from sugar and sex and money to music and love and religion, we value for reasons. But lying behind and distinct from our reasons are evolutionary reasons, free-floating rationales that have been endorsed by natural selection. Now, by the way, a priori, there's no reason in the world that that couldn't be true. That the reasons, the naturalistic reasons which account for our arisal would underlie and perhaps be concordant with the reasons that we human beings give ourselves. And in fact, that could fund a fairly elegant notion of theology of creation. But the question here is, what is the tie between the free-floating reasons of natural selection, which would tend us to believe that human beings behavioral repertoire should look one way, and it doesn't exactly map that. So that's the question on the table. In this statement and elsewhere, Dennett seems like he does argue for a pretty tight coupling. But he can't do that consistently. So later on he says we have built-in desires to reproduce and to do pretty much whatever it takes to achieve this goal. By the way, he's drawing in this idea originally from the ideas of Richard Alexander, who first floated these in a formal way in a seminal book in the 1980s called The Biology of Moral Systems, in which Alexander says the brains exist to serve the gonads. But Dennett, unlike Alexander, then says, but we also have creeds and the ability to transcend our genetic imperatives. This fact does make us different. Throughout the whole book, and in fact much of the literature in this area wrestles with this tension and, in my view, does not succeed in putting it together in a coherent way. And that may not be so much a problem as with the field. It's just a really impenetrable ambiguity about the relationship of human being to nature. So here we go. Let's jump in. We want to look at evolutionary explanations, naturalistic evolutionary explanations of religion. In fact, as I was sitting here in the audience in the morning, somebody said, well, what do you mean by naturalistic? And this is a wide group from bright, motivated upper division undergrads to postdoc and fellow faculty. So I don't want to presume anything, but I also don't want to bore you. It turns out that the notion of providing a naturalistic explanation within the biological community is a matter of some debate. Now, what's not debated is what in principle it is. It's something like explaining phenomena in terms of observable or repeatable regularities. And then if you can go the distance, testable attributions, testable attributions of causal relations. Now, what that actually means in biology in particular is debated on a number of fronts. For example, there are some biologists and philosophers of biologists, Robert Brandon, for example, who argues that unlike the physical sciences, one of the fundamental causal attributions that we evoke and rightly evoke in biology is the notion of function. That we can rightly say an organ has a function or a behavior has a function. The function can be proximal in terms of what it contributes to the integrity of the body as a system. It can be ultimate in terms of what it contributes to fitness. On the other hand, the philosopher Jerry Fodor says, no, you can't. You ought not talk about function at all. You ought to only talk about effects, that every entity is a cause of some effect, but we can't impute function to it. So there's that debate, actually, in biology right now. Another debate, the next step up in terms of biology of mind is whether it ever makes sense to impute intentions, intentional agents, and whether that causal factor can be rightly invoked. A number of biologists say no, we can attribute impacts of the operations of mental equipment, but not intentions. All that just to say, we're not quite sure what it means. But with what it means when we apply to religions, everybody agrees with. This doesn't mean it's right. But it means something like this. A naturalistic explanation of religion would be an explanation that does not employ the objects of religious belief in a causal account of those beliefs or their attendant affects or behaviors. If you believe in God or witches or demons or angels, a naturalistic account of that would be an account for why you believe that and why you have the capacity to believe that, independent of whether angels or demons or gods have ever had a transaction with you. It doesn't mean attributing falsity or causal inertness to what is believed in. It doesn't mean that there is no God. And it doesn't mean even that there are no miracles. It just means that we agree not to use miracles in an account of how humans came to have the capacity to believe in God. Now, at face value, that seems, I have to say, even as a religious believer, that sounds pretty fair, and I think that I could learn a lot from such accounts. But there are a number of questions it raises. First of all, not employing the objects of belief in the formation of belief is kind of an unusual position. For example, to not employ that chair in a causal account of why I think there's a chair there is unusual. Now you might say, well, the chair is physical, so that makes sense, but there are non-physical things. Well, okay, let's take a mathematical proposition. There's nothing physical there, but nevertheless, I use the contents of the Pythagorean theorem in a causal account of why it is I, in fact, embrace the Pythagorean theorem. So there's some difficult problems here. Dennett says this. He says, in order to explain the hold that various religious ideas and practices have on people, we need to understand the evolution of the human mind. In fact, he means something a little bit modest. He not only means we need to do this, but he argues that if we do this, we will have a sufficient explanation for why people do embrace religious beliefs. And notice his language here. It's not in order to explain why people choose to believe religious things. We're explaining their hold on us. And that would be a little odd, wouldn't it, if we said in order to explain the hold that the Pythagorean theorem has on people, we need to understand the evolution of the human mind. Well, in part, that's true, actually, but not in total. In order to understand the hold that the Pythagorean theorem has, we need to understand something of mathematics, the internal logic of a belief structure. Dennett begins with a quote from Hume, in which he says the two great challenges in coming to an account of religion are, first of all, assessing the reasons for it, and secondly, assessing its origin in human nature. And where this field has gone is strictly down the latter path, with the assumption that the former is irrelevant to understanding the phenomena. At the very least, even if we wanted to do what Dennett said, I think that we might want to distinguish between an evolutionary account of the capacity to have religious concepts and the content of specific religious concepts. So we, for example, giving an evolutionary account of the human capacity to do mathematics is perfectly fair. Giving an evolutionary account of mathematical propositions, well, that could be actually true if there were evolved cognitive biases, for example. But I don't know that we want to tie our hands behind our back at the beginning of the game. There may be other causal explanations there. Okay, here's the second question that informs this field. So what I've said up until now is there's a metaphysical neutrality here. It doesn't start with a commitment that there's no God. It's just that we won't use God or God-like entities in religious explanations. And that seems fair. In fact, it not only seems fair, in one hand it seems very advisable. For one, it preserves the metaphysical neutrality of science, extremely important. To do otherwise would be methodologically problematic. If you're going to rule as false the metaphysical commitments, certain metaphysical commitments, how do you decide which ones are true and which ones are false? Is it just ad populum, majority rules? And thirdly, I was just at some really fun meetings on evolution of religion, and it just, they were held in Hawaii, so they attracted pretty much everybody who's working in the field right now, just I think by virtue of the place. And this last topic came up. One advantage of affirming neutrality toward the truth or falsity of religious beliefs is that it's an important strategic commitment. In very much the same way anthropologists would want to be, or at least appear to be, neutral about the values of the cultures they were seeking to gain interest to. If you went into a religious culture and wanted to study it, it would be a lot harder if you either told people or they quickly inferred that these people want to study why I believe things that are so ridiculous, which in fact is exactly what Dawkins did in this recent TV series. So those are all in favor of neutrality. But here's some arguments actually against neutrality toward the truth or falsity of religious beliefs in the study of those beliefs. First of all, there's something that I would call the Miracle on 34th Street syndrome. Miracle on 34th Street is a kind of a tear-jerker Christmas movie from the US. I don't know if it's made it into the UK, but it involves a man who thinks he's Santa Claus and is put on trial for insanity. And his defense says, well, he's not insane. And the judge says, well, of course he is. He thinks he's Santa. Well, he's only insane if there is no Santa. And I intend to prove there is one. And the judge is weighing the political outcomes of this trial. He's up for election that year, and he says, this court will keep an open mind and hear arguments on both sides of the existence of Santa Claus. So there's, to start with, science needs not to fall victim to the Miracle on 34th Street syndrome, the idea of keeping open to things that clearly are absurd, that we shouldn't be open to. Although that distinction is, I was talking with Ernan the other day about, there are things like crop circles, for example, which just through hundreds of years of accumulated history, there's the broad, shared, and deeply shared commitment that, no, we're not open to that. There's a deeper reason, though. The quality of the explanandum influences the nature of the explanans. And what I mean by that is this. If I wanted to explain why Rodney Holder thought he was Rodney Holder, I would go back and find his mom and look at his birth records. If I wanted to explain why Dennis Alexander thought he was Rodney Holder, I would be looking for a very different kind of explanation. And so if we want to propose an explanation for the origins of beliefs, if we're convinced that the beliefs are false beliefs, it is not only right, but it's necessary to include in the explanans the commitment to acknowledging that the beliefs are false. Now that gets tricky, because not only everybody believes what beliefs are false. And then lastly, and most interestingly, now that last point was just arguing if a belief were false, the fact that it is false ought to be part of what you're explaining. Well, it turns out that some explanations of religion from an evolutionary content not only explain the falsity of the beliefs, but use the falsity of the beliefs as part of the explanans. The fact that some beliefs are false and demonstrably false and clearly false to anybody else ends up counting in some versions of evolutionary accounts as what are called costly signals that set people up, actually marginalize them from the rest of the community. Believing weird things is an effective way of drawing communities together in religious cohesion. So those are some arguments against neutrality. And right now, the field hasn't overtly worked these things out, but I'll mention that out of several hundred people working in the field, virtually, I only know of 2 who don't think religious beliefs are false. All religious beliefs are false. And the group that does, roughly half of them are pretty emphatic about saying they are and using the fictitiousness as part of their explanation. Others, like David Sloan Wilson, just say they're fictions, they're useful fictions. The fact that they are fictions doesn't matter one way or another to my theory, but let's not play games, they're fictions. Okay, lastly, we might want to say if the fictitiousness of a religious belief could count in the explanation, would this methodological sword cut 2 ways? Could the potential truth of it count? Now, I mean, this gets hard, but yesterday we spoke a little bit about a resurrection. And if there were other kinds of arguments for, if not the reality, at least the plausibility of an empirical event, saying something like the Trinity or something, could that count in a naturalistic explanation of why people would believe such a thing? That's a question that's itself not explicitly, it's not addressed, it's not even explicitly raised in the field yet. So that's what we mean by naturalistic approaches. How about, what do we mean by religion? Boy, I'm not going to exhaustively do this one, but I do want to start with what's called in ecology Hutchinson's dictum. G. Evelyn Hutchinson was a famous ecologist at Yale some years back, and he said, and I say this to my students all the time, the most important decision an ecologist makes is where to get out of the car. That is to say, what system you study is crucial in terms of the conclusions you reach. And it turns out what definition of what counts as religion is crucial in determining the conclusions we reach. And right now in the field of evolutionary studies of religion, out of all the thousands of different definitions that have existed over the last several hundred years, most of them coalesce into 2 approaches. One approach goes back to Tyler's classic 1876 definition of religion. A minimum definition of religion is the belief in spiritual beings. Virtually all the people working in cognitive science and memetics theory take something along these lines. Religion is just belief in supernatural agents. But it's interesting that population geneticists and selection theorists take a different approach to religion, more along the lines of sociological, Weberian or Durkheimian, or classic definition by Clifford Geertz. A religion is a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, pervasive, long-lasting moods and motivations in men by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence. And lots of other, Peter Berger has an updated version of this. But it's interesting that the field is kind of coalesced into 2 very different conceptions of religion, and it's not surprising that they're ending up with very different explanatory accounts. Here's one. Religion, or religious faith, is the inner conviction that something is true or right or virtuous. I've actually extracted this from a description from Richard Dawkins about what he believes faith is. Faith to him is a disease, and the patient with the disease typically finds himself impelled by some deep inner conviction that something is true, right, or virtuous. We doctors refer to such a belief as faith. So faith is a disease that infects people and presents symptoms like believing in something as being really true or right or virtuous, but scientists are the doctors that can cure people of the faith disease. The religious faith in particular is the most virulent disease. He argues later on that it's more virulent than the smallpox virus, but more difficult to eradicate. That definition doesn't seem to fall into either of these two, but actually it's the former. The faith disease, for Dawkins, typically involves beliefs in supernatural agents without evidence that are passed along not by reason but by epidemiological processes of idea transmission. Well, I want to argue it's not a disease, it's a syndrome, if we want to use this metaphor. That is to say, religion if we were taking this epidemiological view, it's a suite of symptoms that involve cognitive dispositions and commitments, that involve affective or emotional and noumenal experiences, and those aren't the same things, that involve individual behaviors and social structures, and that even involve, on a larger scale, ecological life histories, that any particular religious tradition goes through describable and oftentimes regular oscillations of development and senescence, and that over not the ecological time but the evolutionary time there appears to be a trajectory to the development of religions. So if we really want to think of an explanation of religion, we have to consider all of these aspects and religion in all of these dimensions. And then lastly, there's mixed and possibly, almost certainly, conflicting etiologies. And I want to remind you that what it is we're trying to explain is not multivalent. So you have, it can be explained from the genetic to the neurological to the cognitive levels of scale. And then each one of these levels of scale, there's a different level, proximate or ultimate level of explanation. And by that I mean immediate causal mechanisms as the proximate explanations, and ultimate explanations as the historical evolutionary forces, possibly that conferred function onto them. Now, the current field of evolutionary studies of religion is located in this lower quadrant, looking for ultimate explanations of the cognitive and social dimensions of religion. And then lastly, promise the last kind of perhaps overly pedantic graphic, but I want to remind you 2 slides ago what it is that we're trying to explain. We would be trying to explain the capacity for religious cognition. And then many theorists are actually trying to explain the content of religious beliefs. So not just the generic capacity, but whether there are central tendencies and constraints on what people do believe. The capacity for religious affection and particular religious experiences, and then religious practices. There are a number of evolutionary proposals for these. I'll say a few words about these in just a minute. We might call all of these secondary causes, and there's the possibility, since we're talking about what many people believe to involve exchanges of God, at some point there's the possibility of primary causation. And furthermore, and lastly, what we mean by an evolutionary explanation is often conflated. Many people, and I regret to say many fellow evolutionary biologists, think that if they provide an account of the benefit of a particular feature, they've given an evolutionary explanation. Well, of course they haven't. And in fact, many intelligent design theorists would say they've given an argument for design. Stephen Jay Gould, in his last great book, made this comment. He talked about a crucial but often disregarded distinction between reasons for historical origin and basis for current utility. The common conflation of these entirely separate notions has engendered enormous confusion in evolutionary theory, and I agree with him wholeheartedly. So we need to distinguish between an account which explains the origin of any one of these versus its present maintenance. And right now, none of the claimed evolutionary proposals for religion actually do explain the origin. They're all along the notions of maintenance, what mechanisms currently maintain them. So at the very least, you have this 5 by 5 by 2 explanatory matrix of 50 different possibilities, each one with many, many different proposals within them. The field is extraordinarily complex right now, and therefore when somebody like Pascal Boyer publishes a book, Religion Explained, the title is probably a little bit overreaching, since it's only one tiny aspect of religion which he is proposing one kind of explanation for. But what are those accounts? And I want to emphasize just 2 major streams of explanation and evolutionary theories of religion. There are lots of ways of categorizing these, but for the sake of time, I just want to emphasize they tend to coalesce into two major approaches, and one involves non-adaptationist accounts. Now, they're thoroughly biological, and in fact, even thoroughly evolutionary, but there are lots of characteristics of living organisms that simply aren't adaptations. They come about by other means, and the two dominant non-adaptationist accounts in current evolutionary theories are the viral contagion model, that religion is a virus more deadly than the smallpox virus. Dan Dennett opens his book, actually the very first page of the book, describing a virus that enters ants and makes them do crazy things. So viruses can enter you. They're not adaptations, at least to the virus holder, but if they are well transmitted, they involve adaptations for themselves. I'm actually not, but this is a very interesting and highly prominent account because the two chief advocates are Dawkins and Dennett, whose books in this area have sold more than all the other books combined. But I'm not going to spend much time on this. First of all, not many people actually working in the field are employing this model. It's theoretically underdeveloped right now, and as far as I know, there hasn't been a single empirical study to test this. So I just want to say it's out there, it's interesting. Let's see where it leads, but right now it's not attracting a lot of serious scientific attention. In fact, the people most energetically promoting it are not working on it. On the contrary, the cognitive spandrel model is the dominant model in the field. And a spandrel is just a byproduct of a structure that has some other adaptive function. This is one of the two great contenders for evolutionary explanations of religion right now. There's several different versions. One of them is that religion is just emotional compensation. It's a spandrel, a byproduct of religious needs that were adaptive in other ways for other functions. This goes all the way back to Freud, although he didn't phrase it as a evolutionary hypothesis, but the evolutionary psychologist Lee Kirkpatrick has picked this up, has a very interesting new book on attachment and religion, that religion is just attachment inclinations gone awry. Rodney Stark, who has become a Christian actually, but didn't start out one, I believe, has a notion of religion involving negotiating with unseen entities for goods which can't be purchased, like eternal life. Any of these may be true. The problem is, these are actually some ideas that it's possible to test somewhat experimentally, and they're coming out wanting right now. First of all, they don't concord with developmental observations of the origin of religious beliefs. So it's pretty clear that young children are innately religious. Before, presumably, they have fears of death, for example, and a number of the other factors which the emotional compensation advocates argue. So emotional compensation may contribute to the development, but they don't seem to constitute the initial appearance of religious concepts. And secondly, with many of these people argue that ultimately religious belief comes from fear of death. And one of the things that seems a little problematic is, but Epicurus thought he solved the fear of death too by the exact opposite of it, invoking gods. He solved death by getting rid of the supernatural and any notion that there was life after death. In fact, some people argue that the very existence of belief in the transcendent is the reason for people's fear of death. So I'm not sure how this works, except I would say that as a scientific explanation, it doesn't seem to work very well. If you can say, well, people invent gods because they're afraid of death, and people also uninvent gods because they're afraid of death. I'm going to skip this one. By far the dominant and actually most empirically substantiated view has come to be known as hyperactive agency detecting. And the way this idea, and the three main advocates of this are Pascal, Boyer, Scott Atran, and then actually right here in the UK, Justin Barrett, who's up at Oxford right now. I mentioned at the beginning that out of the several hundred people working in this field, there are really only two that don't seem hostile to religion, and Justin is one of them. He's a professing Christian, actually, and very involved in his faith, that he's a co-developer of this idea, and it's Justin who developed this term. I want to thank Justin, in fact, for the next several slides, but the way it works is that we know that there's an innate intuitive physics and an innate intuitive psychology that begins to develop very soon after birth. Young infants can distinguish between animate and inanimate objects, and that's a fascinating series of research which I'm not going to go into, but has been well documented. And the notion is that this agency detecting device, and whether it's a place in the brain or whether it's a suite of mental characteristics that come together to perform this function, is not relevant here, but that the agency detection device ends up conferring a robustness of agent concepts that involve, first of all, hyperactive agency detectors. People in general, and young people in particular, attribute agents all the time where there are not agents. And furthermore, those agents have magnified qualities of surviving death, of potency, and of knowledge. And then lastly, any sort of teleological inference seems to promote an attribution of an agent. In fact, all sorts of interesting experiments where, I mean, people know that computers aren't people, but it's pretty easy to get people to treat computers as though they have feelings, personalities, and even gender. We can like or dislike computers based on the kinds of voices we give them. Infants appear to process thoughts as social intentional agents, and at 5 months old they can discriminate between random movement and matched movement. And 9 months old can tell when the chaser becomes the chasee, and it can even invoke a laugh if you just have the right cadence of switching direction. And adults, depending on slight nuances, ended up attributing beliefs, desires, and sometimes gender to these simple little dots. These are a fascinating series of experiments that Justin did. They had a closed box, and 3-year-olds actually believed that all agents knew what was in the box. 3-year-olds appeared quite readily to assume omniscience to agents. By the time kids were 5, only God knew what was in the box. Other people didn't know what was in the box. Now that's knowing. In terms of perceiving, their belief in the ability to perceive in darkness was evaluated, and 3-year-olds assumed everybody could see in the dark. God, Maggie, monkey, kitty. By 6, only God and the cat could. So what appears is that rather than these notions of super perceiving and super knowledge being learned, they appear to be unlearned. And they appear to be native to our understanding of the nature of agents. Immortality, by the way, is another one. Fascinating experiment in which they showed 3-year-olds, this might have been a little troubling, but they showed 3-year-olds a snake eating things. So then they put the snake in a box, and they put snake food in the box, and they asked the 3-year-old, is the snake still in the box? Yes. Is the snake food still in the box? No. And they switched the snake food with a mouse. And they'd shown movies prior of a snake eating a mouse. Is the snake still in the box? Yes. Is the mouse still in the box? No. Is the snake still alive? Yes. Is the mouse still alive? Yes. So the mouse wasn't in the box anymore, but the mouse was still alive. Now, what does all this mean? I mean, these are empirical studies, but one of the things, and I'll just confess my own sins here, I'm not sure how much they explain, but they surely do seem to indicate that many of the fundamental aspects that we attribute to supernatural agents appear to be cognitively innate. And they, over the course of development, unlearning them would be one way of saying it. Perhaps a better way of saying it is our attributions become more parsimonious. We become more circumspect about the world to which we apply these concepts. I would want to distinguish, though, between the notion of products and byproducts. All of these accounts that I just gave you view religion as a byproduct without evolutionary adaptation. But actually, none of them involve any evidence to argue that they are byproducts. So there's an evidential question there. There's also a methodological question. And this gets back to a debate that I mentioned at the very beginning of our talk. It's not clear. Some people argue that scientists shouldn't speak of any distinction between products and byproducts. That everything is a product of some cause, and there's no such thing as a causal byproduct. Something's only a byproduct if you attribute foreignness to something. But we ought not attribute foreignness. It's not a debate I'm going to explore, but it's a debate that is waging right now. I'd want to draw the distinction between a hyperactive agency detector and an imprecise agency detector. Hyperactive means there's a bias in error. That hasn't been demonstrated, by the way. It's just simply been assumed. In fact, it's not exactly clear how you would demonstrate that, because you're talking about belief in unseen, invisible agents. And in fact, if there really were an unseen creator of the cosmos, who in some way infused our cognitive capacities with the properly used the ability to infer his existence, then all belief in all these other agents, leprechauns and witches and fairies, along with that agent, would seem to be less hyperactive than not believing in that agent would be underactive. So I'm not sure how you distinguish hyperactivity versus simply imprecision. Certainly it is imprecise. And then lastly, there's what has been called the Mickey Mouse problem. That is to say that even if the agency detector is hyperactive and is attributing all sorts of agents to the world out there, like leprechauns or fairies or Mickey Mouse, we still have not come very far in explaining religion. Because religion involves the attribution of a sacred agent who invokes worship or awe or moral assent. None of these figures in any of these domains actually do that. They're simply counterintuitive agents. So it's not really clear we've explained religion in any meaningful way. In terms of religious implications, I just want to mention that all of these accounts actually assume pathology without demonstrating pathology. The mimetic accounts, the viral contagion accounts, for sure are pathological. Many of the byproduct accounts either believe it's useless, but most of them believe it is injurious. So in a widely read public article by Paul Bloom in The Atlantic several months ago, he describes religious faith as a byproduct gone awry. Now, it's one thing to call something a byproduct, and it's another thing to say that it's gone awry. That is to say that it's working mischief. And to Paul's credit, we were on a panel together a few weeks ago, and I called him on this. I said, what's your evidence for saying it's gone awry? The evidence for calling it a byproduct is sketchy enough, but if I grant that, why gone awry? And so he wouldn't say that anymore. I don't think he retracted that. But Dennett and Dawkins still would. They would argue that it's a byproduct gone awry. And lastly, does had imply the unreliability of beliefs? There's arguments that exist that because we have this hyperactive agency detector, we ought not trust religious propositions. Well, if it were hyperactive, and it's not clear it is imprecise, but there are all the sorts of human sensory and cognitive inputs that are imprecise. This in some way gets back to Peter Harrison's talk the other day. And I would say we ought not trust any single human faculty. That's why we have a system of checks and balances in employing multiple faculties, empirical and rational, and we do it in community. So the fact is that religious beliefs don't simply brutally emerge out of some cognitive intuition in any individual. That over the course of an individual's lifetime, they're tested by observation and reason, and people's people's own theological understanding change over the course of their life. And that's certainly true over the course of communities as well. So religious beliefs, like scientific beliefs, have changed over time. So my response to whether religious beliefs are unreliable because they generated by had is, first of all, it's not clear had is had, but secondly, that would constitute the genetic fallacy, actually. Though the germ of religious ideas may have its origin there, that doesn't account for their development, substance, and maintenance. Okay. I mentioned Paul Bloom. Just a few weeks ago, he had a review in Nature called The Origins of Adult Resistance to Science, in which he argued that basically we have creationists in high schools because adolescents all believe in the supernatural natively, long before they get their dose of science. And he argues that a one-word encapsulation of his argument here in this science review is, why do adolescents believe in God? Now, I would pose a different question. I think that's an interesting question. But another question would be, why do adolescents wish their parents didn't believe in God? And that is, I'm being a little tongue-in-cheek here, but I'm pointing out the fact that one of the things that none of the spandrel accounts explain is why these cognitive spandrels end up making such profound demands on human behavior. And extraordinarily costly investments, and that's where I want to go second and last. Those are evolutionary accounts that are adaptationist in nature, that evolution that religious belief, in fact, performs an adaptive function, and in order to perform that function, it requires a lot of us. So I would want to remind you from yesterday, and I'm going to amp up the rate a little bit. Is that okay? And if I'm losing you, make a face at me. I want to remind you from yesterday that the kernel of group selectionist thinking is that I can sacrifice for Dennis within my group as long as the penalty, the intra-group decrement in my fitness relative to Dennis's, is less than the variance between our group and another group. So that means that in order for group selection to work, we have to reduce intra-group variance. If we can keep intra-group variance in cooperative generated fitness differences, we can keep that low, group selection can work. So we need mechanisms of reducing variance. And there are two. One of them is positive assortment. That is to say, the ability to recognize other cooperators within a group so I don't get burned by the non-cooperators. And the other is social controls. The ability to penalize defectors so that we can keep the level of defection low. Either or both of those things can facilitate group selection, and it is religion that is posed as a solution to both those problems, positive assortment and social controls. And I want to give you a deeper notion of how that works. And in order to do that, let's just go back to the prisoner's dilemma yesterday. I argued, how do you get out of the Nash equilibrium of mutual defection? Well, it turns out if you have iterated prisoner's dilemma, the same person playing with each other more than once, that was solved about 20 years ago in a famous series of computer simulations done by Robert Axelrod, and many of you have seen this. But the strategy that works best and comes to dominate is just tit for tat. I'll cooperate with you if you cooperate with me. Robert Sapolsky at Stanford argues that this strategy is simply formulated in the Golden Rule. I actually think he's wrong on that. The Golden Rule doesn't say, I'll cooperate with you if you cooperate with me. The Golden Rule says, I will do to you what I wish you would do to me. Very different rule, actually. A rule that is designed to break down commitment barriers rather than sustain alliances that already exist. But in any case, what Martin Novak did, just the program for evolutionary dynamics at Harvard just a couple of years ago, is he said, yeah, let's introduce this though. Let's imagine, and we don't have to imagine very hard, that no player is perfect, that sometimes I misread your signal to me. You may have communicated, but cooperated, but I misread it as a defection. Or I intend to cooperate, but I'm not perfect. Sometimes I get it wrong. In that system, moving on to someone else could be costly because you're moving on from a cooperator. So he introduced what he called generous tit for tat. If he introduced noise into the system, it turned out that somebody who was willing to forgive one defection before moving on, that strategy came to dominate. So we started out with tit for tat, and pretty soon everybody was generous tit for tat. But once that strategy began to dominate, you get a little more generous and forgive more than one problem. He ran this long enough, and he ended up with unconditional cooperation, wholesale generosity. And everybody was an unconditional cooperator. It was a community of pure altruism. But the problem, of course, is this community was entirely vulnerable to invasion by defectors, because now everybody would cooperate with you no matter what. And so he got invasion by wholesale cheating, which drove the community back to the necessity for tit for tat. This work was published in Science too, a really wonderful model. So how do we get out of this cycle? Which, by the way, seems to conceptually map the resurgence and demise of enthusiastic religious communities as well. Well, it's back to social controls. You can prevent that by social controls. And in a really seminal paper by Ernst Fehr in Switzerland, another work was published in Nature not too long back. Fehr actually demonstrated in a series of game theory experiments that the implementation of social controls does enhance cooperation and reduce defection. And then in a follow-up study, he actually did fMRIs and found that, first of all, by the way, people punished altruistically. That is to say, they invested more in punishment than they could possibly get out of punishment. They paid for punishment. And they found that the caudate nucleus of the brain was activated. They professed to experiencing great pleasure in doing this punishment. And their brain lit up to verify this. Now you might think, oh yeah, people really enjoy revenge. No, it wasn't revenge, actually. They did not punish in proportion to how much they were hurt. Turns out they punished in proportion to how much the behavior of the person being punished deviated from the mean level of cooperation of the group. They punished unfairness, not personal injury. So the notion is that this mechanism, that human beings are wired to invest substantially in punishment of unfair community behaviors. Now we might also be maliciously vengeful, but this is a different mechanism altogether. And by the way, it's one, I'm not going to describe it here, but the prototypes of which we've seen in non-human animals as well. But there are problems with this. I mean, it surely exists, but it doesn't explain everything. First of all, there are empirical anomalies. There are levels of communication, human cooperation and altruistic sacrifice that not only don't take punishment to induce, but oftentimes exist in the face of punishment. I'm thinking now again of Holocaust rescuers. Nobody punished Holocaust rescuers to get them to do that. In fact, they did that behavior in the face of likelihood of extraordinary punishment. And secondly, and here's where we're jumping into religion specifically, we have the problem of secondary defectors. If it costs to punish defectors, you can have defectors on the punishment. Those who don't pay the cost of punishment itself. This would appear to implement an infinite regress of punishment and defectors. What's the way out? Well, the proposal for the way out is, now I'm just going to run through this. You can think it's silly. I think it is speculative. There's some empirical evidence to suggest it's worth looking at. But there's a series of thinking here. To solve this problem of defection regress, it ends up involving religion. The problem of secondary defectors or punishment-free riders can be solved by the internalization of punishment, the internalization of cognitive cosmic sanctions. Somebody asked the other day about belief in an afterlife. Well, the idea here is that if you could get people to believe there are cosmic sanctions, heaven and hell, or karma, or just believe that the universe itself were morally structured in a way to have intrinsic benefits and disbenefits for moral and immoral behavior, nobody would have to actually pony up with the cost of punishment if people could really believe this. By the way, how on earth could you get people to believe this? And it's hard to imagine this happening without group selection. It would look something like this. If you believe that you're going to hell for defecting on somebody who cooperates with you, heaven becomes the Nash equilibrium. This isn't my diagram, by the way. I think it's submitted somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but somewhat seriously by a game theorist named Joseph Buglia. Now, I think you can, this is my work, you can nuance this to more than just a simplistic notion like this. You could make it more Catholic and say, well, if you cooperate with those who are cooperating with you, what good is that to you? I mean, even tax collectors do that. If you really want to get rewarded, you have to cooperate with those who defect on you. Or you could make it more concordant with the spirit of kind of mean-spirited American fundamentalism. But in any case, the idea here is that an internalized matrix of reward and punishment is ascribed to have adaptive value. But there's a problem. You can get tertiary defectors, and that's simply people who don't internalize it. Unbelievers, or in today's parlance, brights. I simply don't believe it. And the solution would be behave costly practices or costly signals of belief. Now, this is a sociological theory that goes back 100 years or so, but was made 20 years ago in an evolutionary proposal by the anthropologist William Irons, and just recently has actually generated quite a bit of empirical work. And I think it's very impressive empirical work, primarily by the anthropologist Richard Sosis, who splits his time between Israel and the U.S. Sosis' first view just looked at the longevity of communities, religious versus secular, and found that religious communities, secular communities tend to die out between 20 and 30 years, and religious communities lasted 80 to 100 years. By the way, he had to throw out the Hutterites, because the Hutterites lived 200 years, and it just skewed the data. And then he actually asked this question. He says, what if I look at the number of costly practices within communities, and found the more publicly observable costly displays of commitment, the longer the community lasted. He's done a lot of other work since then, but it does appear to indicate that a community-sustaining function for exactly the proposal of William Irons from 20 years ago of costly practices. But there's a problem. The problem is quaternary defectors. Hypocrites, those who do the practices, but only because they calculate the payoff. So, in fact, Jesus challenged this in many of his teachings. He says, when you give, don't give as the Pharisees, as the hypocrites do, trumpeting it before others, but give in secret. So hypocrites in this case are people who do the practices, but only to the extent that they pay off, and they actually don't really believe. And the solution to this is hard to fake signals. Now, this is a proposal that has just emerged within the last couple of years. The difference between costly signals, which is a long-standing theory in biology, not just for humans, but in non-humans. The peacock's tail is a costly signal, for example. Hard to fake signals are not so much how they cost, but biologically how they're invoked. They're autonomic or involuntary displays that most people can't fake. So blushing or laughing or laughter are very difficult to fake. And the notion here is that if you really believe, there are involuntary affective manifestations of your belief, which are signals of that belief. By the way, there's an evolutionary, recent paper on evolutionary theories of laughter that take exactly the same approach. Most of us can spot a wannabe laugher who's just laughing because they want to be part of the crowd versus somebody who really sees the humor in a joke. And oftentimes humor in a joke is not something that can be explained. You see it or you don't. And so the same notion here is that religious affection is a hard-to-fake signal of seeing the same thing and sharing a kindred commitment. Now, this is something which makes sense, but there really hasn't been a lot of empirical work on. There has been some inference from the historical record of the dramatic spread of religions, where religions have spread dramatically and non-coercively. So I'm not talking about the conquistadors. Non-coercively, many times the most permeable religious expansions across boundaries of culture, of race, of gender, and of social class have involved movements with magnified religious affect. So the most prominent present example is the explosion of Pentecostal versions of Christianity, largest growing religious faith in the world right now, I think. Maybe there'd be some debate over that in Islam, but 100 years ago, current Pentecostal movement started out with about 200 people in Los Angeles, California. That's now expanded to recent estimates of 500 million people in every continent, every country in the world. But there's a problem here too, and this is the last problem. The problem is the existence of quaternary defectors. And those are individuals who have the hard-to-fake signals, and think they believe what they say they believe, but don't actually believe what they say they believe. It's the problem of self-deception that we talked about yesterday, or religious sentimentality. Oscar Wilde defines sentimentality as the desire to have the pleasure of an emotion without the willingness to pay its price. And it's certainly possible. Jeremiah says, you people delight in the sound of the music, but you don't heed the words thereof. So religious sentimentality is, in one sense, involves a sincere investment in even relishing of a suite of religious affections that are somehow uncoupled from willing engagement with the moral demands of the tradition itself. Maybe one of the greatest assessments and confrontations of this phenomenon would be the American Jonathan Edwards' treatise on the religious affections. But in any case, what's the way out of this? And this is the end of the road here. Here I'm using a non-religious person's term. Randy Nesse at the University of Michigan talks about authentic intersubjective commitment. A couple of years ago he had an edited volume precisely on this. Authentic intersubjective commitment involves a genuinely internalized benefits and unbearable costs of beliefs. That is to say, if a belief is sufficiently internalized, there are consequences inside the individual for living up to it or not living up to it. It involves a union of cognition and affect and practice, which we might call caritas. Now, is there what we're talking about here actually is correcting the problem that we ended up with at the end of last lecture, that there's no account of actual internalization of a place in the workings of the organism for beliefs in altruism. Is there any data to suggest that this is true? I've got 2 more minutes. Well, on a series of scales there is. First of all, we know that social marginalization, that is to say, to not be part of a trusting community, has painful neurological impacts. And Robert Sapolsky, again at Stanford, has looked at marginalization in various primate groups and has found incidence in coronary heart disease, a diminishment of immunological vigor, higher mortality rates in general. Robert Putnam has looked at a composite of social involvement that involves things like voting and volunteerism and a number of other things, which he calls the social capital index, and looked at the effect of that on actual measures of health. So here are a couple of them. Child welfare index, which involves the frequency of serious immunological childhood diseases, of drug addiction, of finishing high school, children out of wedlock. There's a positive correlation there, but more to the purposes I want to make is he's actually found a strong correlation between what he calls the social capital index and the health status index of adults. There are apparently health effects at the communal level for the establishment of these kinds of communities. This germinal insight goes back to a paper in Science from the mid-1980s. So we've known for a long time. There's been some flaky work in terms of the health effects of religious involvement, I should say. But there's some very, very good work done in terms of the health effects in genuine intersubjective commitment. And in fact, we're beginning to unravel a mechanism. So Paul Zak, a neuroeconomist at UCLA, has found that receiving a trust signal actually promotes the release of oxytocin, the hormone oxytocin, which has a cascade of a number of health beneficial effects. And most recently, I don't have the data here, but Zak actually did the reverse. He got an aerosol along with Ernst Fair, the game theorist whose work I cited earlier. An aerosolized version of oxytocin, sprayed it in people's noses, and found that it promoted trust measurably when they had them play various trust games. All this comes together in a fabulous study, last study I'll mention, done by Stephanie Brown and Brandy Nessie at the University of Michigan. We've known for 20 years that involvement in supportive communities extends life expectancy of people diagnosed with terminal diseases, and we assume that's because people need support. And they just ask, this kind of gets back to what I mentioned at the very beginning of the last lecture. Could you have an out-of-the-box hypothesis inform your research program in a way that is possible to detect empirically? They ask, well, what if it's really true, the old biblical injunction, it's better to give than to receive? So in these social groups, they went back and they categorized people. They first of all controlled for health status, and then they just looked at who was giving more and who was receiving more. And it turns out that the people who were primarily dependent, giving, actually had higher mortalities than if they weren't in the group. And the people that were primarily giving support had substantially lower mortalities. So it's not just being in a support group, it's what you actually do in the support group. So we have an interesting confluence now of data suggests that genuine intersubjective commitment, giving to others, a theoretical paradigm for at least exploring how religion promotes that. And where does that leave us? Two concluding comments. First of all, should a religious believer be nervous about providing a functional explanation for religion? On one level, I would say, well, certainly not. If we believe that human beings are so constituted so as to best function with belief, that's exactly what we would expect. And in some sense, man shall not live off bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. On another sense, it does raise legitimate problems, not for the truth of religious belief, but in a series of papers by Alex Rosenberg, the philosopher of science, recently, one of them published in Biology and Philosophy, one of them called Darwin's nihilist idea, and he means to challenge Dennett for not having gone so far. Dennett wants to argue that Darwin's dangerous idea corrodes all notions of purpose and teleology, but at the end of his book he wants to leave morality intact. And Rosenberg says, no, you can't do that. If you provide a functional account of the origin of belief in a particular idea that completely uncouples belief in the idea from the truth or falsity of the belief, which Dennett wants to do, that doesn't mean the belief is untrue, but it does erode warrant for believing it to be true. So Rosenberg raises the question of warrant. And I think that's a legitimate question. My response to that would be that these functionalist accounts don't do what Rosenberg say they do. In fact, they don't completely uncouple the belief in God, for example, from the existence of God. They would only do that if the explanatory account went, in a sense, all the way down. Not only why our cognitive machinery is inclined to believe in God, but why we have cognitive machinery to begin with, why we have life to begin with, why we have a cosmos at all rather than nothing, and most importantly, why the cosmos is of such a kind as to generate the life that we have of such a kind. And if we could explain that in a way that not only didn't invoke God, but made inviolable the likelihood of God, then we would have a problem with it. But we're a long ways off for doing that. Okay, so on the other hand, and last, so am I suggesting a kind of a neo-romantic natural theology, going back to the idea of love as creation's final law? I don't think so. I do think there's serious theoretical and empirical warrant now, in contrast to 30 years ago, within the context of evolutionary theory, to believe that humans have evolved to be givers, and that there are internal benefits for human flourishing to do that. There are a number of people working right now on just that who have no religious axe to grind at all. Robert Lee at Harvard has a theory which he calls the live to give theory of transferal of benefits. But it's not a saccharine view. For one thing, we're describing a biotic possibility and not an inevitability. That is to say, this is a morally ambiguous potentiality. And it can go either way. It can generate altruism, but it can also generate the mirror image of altruism, which ecologists call spite. Altruism is helping somebody else's reproductive success at net cost to my own. Spite is hurting somebody else's reproductive success, which we do all the time in competition. And if it's competition, I hurt your reproductive success to gain my own. Spite is hurting you at greater net cost to my own. And these potentialities can go either way. In fact, there's a recent book out, just out a couple of months ago, called Spite, The Dark Side of Altruism. And then lastly, there are costs of this kind of love that we're talking about. It's not just a simple, I'll do it and be happy. There are the costs of genuinely self-relinquishing extension of other regard. Although it may be true that it's more blessed to give than receive, we can give to the point of utter self-emptying. And at least in terms of a naturalistic theory, we've given more than we've received. Maybe there's something beyond nature, but the utter kenotic self-emptying that is at least possible isn't just a happy story of a better life. And then lastly, there's the possibility for the self-destructural denials of other regard. I can injure myself by refusing to give. And I can be injured by the refusal of others to give. In fact, this beautiful story of the evolutionary ascendance, of the capacity to sense and commit to the interior welfare of other beings, which I think is a beautiful story, is also attended by the concomitant story of an increased capacity to feel pain and injury at the hands of others. So in a sense, there's an emergent theodicy in the story that we have just told. So to conclude with this notion, this began with Kierkegaard, so I'll end with him. He says that hypocrisy, artifice, wiliness, and seduction stretch unconditionally as far as love does. They can imitate true love so strikingly that there is no absolute criterion. Because in every expression of truth or of true love, there exists the possibility of deception, which corresponds to it exactly. Yet, to cheat oneself out of love is the most terrible deception. It's an eternal loss for which there is no reparation. Thanks.
Excellent. So, questions for Jeff? Joseph.
Yesterday you gave a very good talk and had a couple of problems. I'm afraid today you think you're giving an even better talk and have even more problems. We don't have very much time, I'll just stick with my favourite, which is the idea that if we explain the origins of religious beliefs, then in effect we explain away religion or indeed falsify it. And I've got a significant problem with that because if you apply the same logic to my physical biological evolution, I've got a fairly good understanding of that, and therefore I falsify my own existence. And so
I think maybe you misunderstood.
I
may not have been clear. I actually don't think that if we explain the origin of religion, we falsify it. I'd want to nuance that in two ways. First of all, if we explain the origin of the capacity for religious belief, we don't falsify it in any way, any more than if we explain the origin of the capacity for mathematical beliefs. We have to assess the content of mathematical propositions and religious propositions on their own terms. So that's for sure. Now, what if we explain the origin of particular propositions, which nobody wants to do for mathematics, but a lot of these theories do want to do for religion. So for example, why do we believe in an afterlife? Well, because it has this payoff for reproductive success, and therefore there's no empirical evidence that this is true, but the proposition is we're actually hardwired to believe in these things, regardless of the inner logic and regardless of whether they're true or not. Now that question, and by the way, this wasn't my idea, it's Alex Rosenberg's. Rosenberg says even that doesn't mean the ideas are false. It doesn't demonstrate them to be false, but it does erode the warrant for our confidence that they're true. I think he has a good point there. I think the way out actually is to say that the present account of those beliefs in fact doesn't explain it in a way that completely uncouples it from the existence or non-existence of God. But if we did, if we had an account all the way down, I think it would reward warrant. Now the interesting thing though is that cuts both ways. It would also cut for warrant, and this is an argument that Al Flanagan makes, but if we had such an account, it would equally erode warrant for believing in the truth of the evolutionary account itself. That is to say, if we could provide such an account for human mentality in general, if it really were demonstrable that the brain exists to serve the gonads, and the things we think are constrained entirely by what pays off reproductively, then we'd have, I think, a profound epistemological problem. But we're not there. I mean, we're not there with mentality in general, and we're not there with religion in particular.
Thank you. I've got a whole list of other problems. I'll discuss those with you later.
Right, Dennis has a question.
Yes, can we come back to our detection device for leading to belief in supernatural beings? I'm just interested to know whether those kind of studies in children have been done in cultures where the religions are not very supernatural. I'm thinking of Taoism, Confucianism, and some forms of Buddhism, where actually, they're not very dependent on, they're much more philosophical in nature. And yet, I mean, there is a discussion, I think, even in China about whether Taoism is a religion at all. Yes. But leaving that aside, I mean, clearly there are others, sort of very abstract, monistic, philosophical religions. Have the same sort of studies been done in developmental psychology on the children from those religions?
They have been, and they've also been done in this culture in secular households where their children weren't taught anything about God. And so this one last question, when they were 6, only God could see these things. Well, who's God? That question wasn't able to be asked. But the other questions were, and the endowment of agents with omniscient and omniperceptual and immortal status appears to be universal.
That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you. Anya.
It's just that I had a similar question, I guess, or also I missed how many, what the sample size was of the studies that were done, how many children were looked at, and also when you say other households that were secular, I mean, say for instance, what we hear so much about now, especially in the US, is all the troubled youngsters and everything like this. I mean, in the very poor neighborhoods, in perhaps I don't know what I'm allowed to say this, but in black neighborhoods, in places even within the community. I mean, it's not for us, looking from the outside. Was that taken into account?
I mean, methodologically, was there care taken to sample from a wide range of socioeconomic?
Yes, for a start, yes.
Well, actually, I direct you to, there's a really interesting review of this work in Justin Barrett's book called Why Would Anyone Believe in God? I guess the simplest response is, although I just showed you a few graphs, but there are really hundreds of studies that have been done in this area, and no one study has been profoundly cross-cultural, but there have been hundreds of studies done in different countries, different socioeconomic status, levels, looking at boys versus girls, and my own sense is that, by the way, none of these actually involve an evolutionary account of religion. There's no evolutionary proposal here. But I personally think the empirical evidence for the innateness of agent concepts, and early on in development, a hypertrophic conceptualization of what it means to be an agent is very compelling.
If I could follow that up slightly, Dawkins seems to make no distinction between belief in God and belief in the tooth fairy. But Alistair McGrath makes the rather interesting point that whilst people grow out of belief in the tooth fairy and indeed in belief in God, he's never known anyone later in life adopt belief in the tooth fairy. So there's something going on there, isn't there? The difference between some of these kinds of beliefs which we grow out of and never go back into, and yet more substantial beliefs.
Yeah, I mean, and that would get, well, I think that raises 2 points. One is the point of whether these hyperactive agency detectors are the source of religious belief, and presumably not ultimately, because some beliefs are sustained and some aren't, and that must involve things like critical reflection. And, on the other hand, however, I think there are multiple explanations for why people grow out of the belief in the tooth fairy, of at least 2 kinds. First of all, the kind of noumenal experiences by which we infer agents may never happen with the tooth fairy. Most kids may believe in a tooth fairy simply because they're like Santa Claus, because somebody they trust tells them they're a tooth fairy. Although there are all sorts of means by which we attribute agency in the natural world. Anytime we see something that looks teleological, we infer it. The story that Ken Miller told the other night about answer to prayer, it's not a tooth fairy who answered that prayer if somebody believed. But here's another reason why people may grow out of the tooth fairy. The origin of the tooth fairy concept, at least in any individual life, is phylogenetically discernible. We know that somebody just made up that idea. Same with Santa Claus. That's a little bit less easy to do with fundamental religious concepts.
Good, thank you, Ernest.
In all these naturalistic approaches to religion, it constantly raises me the question, how do they account for the prophetic figure? Whether it's a Moses or Muhammad or Jesus or Zoroaster, here are people who buck their own group and challenge the accepted conventions of their own group and often suffer for doing so. How do they fit into an evolutionary or naturalistic account?
It's a great question. And right now there's really an interesting divide. The Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett simply don't deal with it at all. And the reason they don't deal with it at all, and a few weeks ago I had an exchange with Dennett on just this, and he was actually very amenable to talking about that. The Dennett-Dawkins view of religion is that it's blind belief without evidence passed down by rigid authority structures, and that the most important thing of religious commitment is that you can't brook dissent. And that actually simply ignores the empirical history of religious traditions, which are filled with dissent and discussion and debate, and as you say, prophetic figures who challenge religious authority oftentimes at their own cost. Now, on the other hand, there are some traditions that actually not only acknowledge it, but make sense of it. In this costly signaling scenario that I gave you, most often the prophetic figure is not one who challenges, who calls somebody heretics or challenges the orthodoxy of belief, but challenges that last level, the level of self-deception or authenticity of religious commitment. So, you know, John the Baptist says, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? I tell you, let your fruits be meat of repentance. Let those of you who have 2 coats give 1. That's a persistent strand in the prophetic tradition that basically challenges that last step of religious sentimentality. That would be made sense of by this account. Not to say it's a right account. But then the last question would be, well, what's the, and you know, of course, the Weberian theory of the routinization of charisma has a sociological treatment of this phenomenon. But none of that answers where the motivations of the prophet himself or herself comes from. And, you know, that's a point at which, as a believer, I'm open to in whatever mysterious way it happens, the reality of a God who discloses himself. But there's nothing in these proposals that would disallow that.
Thank you. Scott?
Yes, just to piggyback on that, yeah, the sense I get with behavioral biology, it's very helpful, as you mentioned. I think in the last time you mentioned maybe not complete, though it seems like there's this, I find it a little disturbing, this kind of concentration on self-reference, positive payoffs or negative consequences. And there's no reference to something outside the naturalistic scheme, like there might be something like a transcendent God is now considered, or which is real, and a transcendent truth. Forget the consequences, is it truthful? And then let the consequences play themselves out after the fact. I think a behavioral biologist would have a hard time maybe understanding a purely charitable act that has no consideration for the consequences, but is just done for the sheer sake that it's the true and good thing to do. And there's not this kind of self-referencing, oh, is it going to be positive or negative for my person, by myself, or the group? And there's just something in me that kind of recoils against that.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Could everybody hear him? He's facing this way. Is there something demeaning and corrosive of the commanding grandeur of religious commitment if we only understand it in terms of its payoff? And the two things I'd want to say to that are, first of all, a naturalistic account of religion in terms of its role in us as living organisms needs to ask that question. That's a fair question for a biologist to ask. Does religious commitment have some sort of payoff to the organism? Whether or not the individual is doing it for that reason. And there are a number of evolutionary accounts that are arguing no. It's a viral contagion. And by the way, I think one mistake is to think that the same answer has to apply to every individual and every religious commitment. I mean, there are toxic religions. And it's not just a function of what religion. So within the Christian tradition, there are all sorts of toxic manifestations of religious commitment. But that's a fair biological question to ask. And I think that there is good evidence to suggest that the way humans are constituted, religion solves a number of problems, of commitment problems in group life. Now that's completely separate from whether people do it for self-interest. Although even there, I wouldn't want to entirely rule out this notion. There, in my view of the religious life, there's this tension between, on the one hand, being swept up in adoration and recognition of something that is greater than ourselves, and on the other hand, being able to say, along with the psalmist, the nearness of God is my good. To be able to recognize, in fact, that the best thing that can ever happen to me is to approach and give myself to this being.
Well,
You've got a panel.
we've got a panel. Yeah, maybe just one more before John.
It's perhaps more in relation to what you were talking about yesterday, but regarding the development of altruism and significance of reciprocal altruism, do you have any comment on the significance of shame as an attitude in this general framework?
Yeah. First of all, I would want to distinguish between shame and guilt, and I think shame is a response to the public revelation of a defection. And it's difficult, first of all, from an evolutionary standpoint, it's difficult to imagine how shame would... Darwin had an account of guilt, by the way, purely on the level of individual selection. It seems like the most efficacious evolutionary account of shame would be in the context of group selection. But secondly, because shame actually involves a suite of oftentimes autonomic and hard to fake affective dispositions. Blushing, for example, and trembling oftentimes. And it simply may function as a portal to re-instantiation in the cooperative matrix of the community.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. I think we have to draw it to a close for the time being and come back.